Okay, hi. This is the lecture on Chapter 13, Aging in the Elderly. Hopefully this will be a quick one. We're going to start with a little bit of terminology. Then I'm going to talk about the graying of the U.S. and what that means. And then we'll end by talking about age stratification. So the fact that, our nation is not only stratified by, socioeconomic class and race and ethnicity and gender, but also somewhat by age. And then we'll finish by talking about some of the problems or challenges that our seniors or elderly citizens in the United States face because of their age. So let's start out then with some basic terminology. I don't think it's maybe earlier in the semester in one of the first couple lectures we talked about cohorts, but I'll go ahead and redefine it. A cohort is basically any group that shares some common demographic or statistical trait, right? So any group that shares a common statistical or demographic trait. And so today what we're concerned with is age cohorts, right? And that's just a group of people born around the same time, or, in other words, within some allotted time frame that we want to talk about. For instance, one of the big reasons, right, for what we'll call the graying of the U.S. or our aging population that I'm going to talk about in a minute is the fact that we have the baby boomer age cohort, right? And so baby boomers are a group of people who were born roughly between 1946 after World War II and 1964, and that's a big age cohort in our population. Before I get to that, though, we can also talk about phases of aging. We use these, sort of different groups for different statistical reasons. We'll see later when I talk about poverty that we use these categories. So thought I'd mention it. Phases of aging, right, or of old age. We talk about the young old as being that group of people 65 through 74, so the youngest cohort within the elderly age group, which is 65 and older. And then the middle old is that group of people age 75 through 84. And then the old, I know these are great terms here, very creative. The old are people ages 85 and up, right? So those are the different categories that we can use to talk about them. And these categories, as far as their ratio to our population, their numbers are increasing pretty rapidly, right? So that's what I want to talk about when I talk about the graying, or that's what I am talking about when I talk about the graying of the U.S., right? This basically means the ratio of people in our population who are 65 and older is increasing or growing very rapidly, right? So our nation is literally getting older. That's the graying of the U.S. The fact that the ratio of people 65 and older is increasing rapidly. And remember that old category, people 85 and older, that's increasing, I think, at the fastest rate out of those three categories, right? So And we might see some change with that as the baby boomers continue to age out. But yeah, so that's the situation that we're in right now as far as the age of our country. If you go back to, I don't know, if you go back hundreds and hundreds of years to the founding of our country, we were literally at the time a young nation and comprised of young people. So if you think about the founding fathers, when they were, working on the Declaration of Independence or signing it or whatever, they were mostly in their 30s, right? So we think about them as old and, gray, but they were actually pretty young. And people at the time were pretty young because life expectancies were a lot lower. So one of the big reasons that we have this rapidly aging population is that over the course, especially the course of the 20th century, life expectancies increased a lot. So if you go back to 1900, the average life expectancy in the U.S. was somewhere around 49 or 50, whereas today, obviously, the average life expectancy is somewhere around 80. Right, so we've managed to increase life expectancy a few decades within the span of the 20th century, and so that's a big reason why we have this aging population. Another reason why we have this aging population is, again, the baby boomers that I mentioned a minute ago. Right, that's a huge age cohort, born between 46 and 64, so most of them, or a lot of them have already aged out, and the rest will be, over 65 very soon, right? So that's also a big reason for the fact that, we have such a large elderly population. Right, our elderly population has grown tenfold since 1900, whereas the rest of our age cohorts have only grown about threefold since 1900. So again, the ratio of the population who's older is increasing. To put that another way, today our elderly population is something like 16% of the total population, whereas in the 1950s it was half that. It was like 8%. And it's estimated that by 2050, the elderly are going to be about 22% of our population. So again, it continues to increase because of life expectancies and the aging baby boomer population. Why is this a big deal? Why does it matter? Well, this affects what's called the dependency ratio in our nation, right? So it affects the dependency ratio, and that's basically the number of productive to non-productive, and that sounds harsh, but it just means people who can work to people who can't work, right? The number of productive to non-productive citizens, right? You need a lot of productive citizens for society to be running smoothly and for to be productive, right? And so the more non-productive citizens you have and that you have to take care of, that's ends up being a huge resource expenditure, right? So this is going to create huge increases in spending on things like Social Security, Medicare, and that's already, Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid are already the bulk of all our social welfare spending because we don't do that much social welfare spending. So it's going to mean a lot more, who knows by the time we get older if we'll have access to the same Social Security. It's questionable. So it's going to affect this aspect of our population. The fact that it's aging is going to affect every institution within our society, right? It's going to affect our government and how we spend our tax dollars. The dependency ratio changing is going to affect our economy. It's going to affect the institution of family because we'll either be taking care of these people within our aging relatives within our own homes, right? Or we'll have to, unfortunately put them in facilities or whatever. So it's going to affect that. Um, it's going to affect, it'll affect healthcare, etc. So it's going to affect every major institution within our society that our society is getting older. And we're going to have to very quickly figure out how to adapt, right, to this difference. I mean, it's already happening, but we're going to have to do a better job of figuring out how to adapt to it. And we can see this now that these older cohorts are particularly susceptible to COVID, right? That we definitely need more infrastructure in place to healthcare infrastructure and things like that to help our elderly. Moreover, this problem of graying, right, the graying of the U.S., we're not the only nation facing this. So, like, all of Western Europe and China, a lot of these developed countries are starting to get older, are starting to age out like this too. It affects their dependency ratios, and it's going to affect the global economy and all kinds of things, right? So we're not in it alone, but it's going to be a kind of not only our problem, but a global problem. All right, now I want to talk a little bit about age stratification, right? Sort of inequality with respect to age. Age stratification, particularly in our society, right? So we know now from other lectures and from experience that our society is obviously stratified socioeconomically by class, right? There's inequality. We know that our society is stratified by race and ethnicity. There's inequality. We know that it's stratified by gender. There's inequality, the pay gap, and things like that. We know about all this now. Our society is also stratified to some extent by age, right? So we live in a society that values very highly youth and beauty and technical knowledge, which I'll get to in a minute, and things like that. So we live in a society where people, being older is not valued so much, and people want to avoid aging because of that, right? So another way of saying this is that we live in a society with relatively low filial piety, right? And all filial piety means is like a sense of reverence for elders, right? For seniors, for older people, for older generations, however you want to put it. A sense of reverence, right? Admiration for those older generations. We have a low level of filial piety. Again, we value youth over age in many aspects of our culture. There are different cultures around the world with higher levels of filial piety. So, Japan, for instance, is one nation that has a pretty high level of filial piety, where people have a lot of respect for their elders. But even in Japan, they're facing the same problem we're facing, where their society's getting older, and even there they've started to utilize nursing homes and things like that. So this problem of having less filial piety in society might be a result, or might be explained by our transition to an industrial society, right? So, I mean, this is only one way of explaining it, but if you go back, say, to pre-industrial societies, in pre-industrial societies, there weren't as many older people, right? Because life expectancies were a lot lower at that point. And so it was rare to have someone who was really elderly. But in pre-industrial societies, the knowledge and experience of older people who had lived through so many seasons and experienced so much, that knowledge and experience was invaluable to them. Like, they needed that knowledge. If you were You know, a farmer, you needed the knowledge of someone who had seen everything that could happen during different seasons, that knew about weather, and then just practical knowledge. You know, this was before medicine was a profession, and people had knowledge of how to treat illnesses and all kinds of different things, right? So all this experiential knowledge was really, really valuable. And so the argument goes with this, that you know, there were in pre-industrial eras much higher levels of filial piety because it was rare to have someone who was elderly and had all this knowledge and experience that was so useful, right? Now, if you fast forward then to, you know, the Industrial Revolution, and industrial eras are now, you know, obviously we live in a post-industrial era. Things are completely different. Once you get to a sort of modernized society, what's more valuable than experience is the technical knowledge. So if you're, you know, in a manufacturing society, how to use these new machines. In our society, it's tech knowledge, literally knowledge of tech, digital tech, right? That's valuable for most, you know, workplaces. And just like getting along in life, how to use, you know, new apps on the phone and things like that. These are things that are easier for younger people and more difficult for older people who haven't been exposed to this technology for their whole lives, right? So I haven't grown up with, you know, with a cell phone, and even computers were pretty rough when I was a kid. But like, you know, young people now have grown up with all those things, and so it's easier for them to have this technical knowledge, and that technical knowledge is really valuable in society. So again, this is just one argument for why we might have less filial piety, but it might have something to do with this transition to modern societies, and how work is in these societies, and how youth then becomes more important than age and experience. All right, so let's move on then. We kind of have an understanding of the fact that we have a relatively low level of filial piety in our nation. Let's talk about some of the problems that the elderly face, right? The problems with getting old in the U.S. with aging, right? The first one, kind of related to this low level of filial piety, or you could say it's a factor in this, is ageism, right? So ageism is just basically prejudice and discrimination with respect to age. So prejudice and discrimination against older people is ageism. So the way that discrimination often happens, or at least one good example, or one unfortunate example, right, of ageism or age-based discrimination is employment discrimination. So having age-based requirements for employment, right? Because I talked about the fact a minute ago that sometimes people in that over 65 category, or the, you know, the middle old or the old categories, have less technical knowledge, right, of how to use tech. And so it might be beneficial for companies not to hire older people or whatever. So any kind of age-based requirement, that's employment discrimination. You know, coerced retirement is employment discrimination. You know, the longer someone's with a company, the more money they tend to make, you know, and they have these benefits packages and things like that, that people might not be getting anymore. So sometimes it can be expensive to have older people who've worked for the company working for the company, and it'd be cheaper to have them retire and bring in new people that you could pay less and not give the same packages and things like that. So there's a lot of employment discrimination. Now, there is an anti-age employment I think it's just called the Anti-Age Discrimination Act. And that's old. That was passed, I think, in 1967. Right? So it's not legal to, take part in age-based discrimination, employment discrimination. But again, it still happens, right? The kind of coerced retirement or not hiring older people, etc. It persists today. And some of the prejudice, like we don't even think about age prejudice because I think we're all guilty of it to some extent, but stereotyping people because they're older and things like that. One example, I think this might be in the book, one example is like if you go to the doctor with a knee problem in your 20s, right, they're going to do all sorts of tests, whereas if you go to the doctor with a knee problem in your 80s, they're just going to blame it on your age, right? They might not even do any kind of follow-up, right? So it's important that we at least be mindful of that prejudice, and then, obviously try to cut back on age-based discrimination. Another problem that our seniors face when they're in care, and that's whether it's the care of their family or in a facility, right, is elder abuse. Now, we only started talking about things like domestic violence and child abuse as recently as the 1960s and 70s. So we've only, unfortunately, started talking about elder abuse within the past few decades. But it's a real problem. And what it means is basically when a caretaker intentionally deprives, right, an elderly person of care, or harms that person. So elder abuse is when a caretaker intentionally deprives an elderly person of care or harms that person, right, that's in their care. So this can happen all sorts of different ways. This can be neglect, right, which is the depriving the person of care. It can be physical abuse. It can be sexual abuse. It can be financial abuse, right? So defrauding an elderly person or taking advantage of an elderly person, scamming them. It could be, or stealing from them. It could be psychological, right? Emotional abuse. And unfortunately, it's kind of like child abuse in that these elderly people often, are in a situation where they can't report this, right? So obviously elderly people with dementia would have trouble reporting these things, or they might be too afraid to report it, etc. So we really don't know how much this occurs. It's estimated from surveys, like self-reporting surveys, that 1 in 10 elderly people in care have experienced some kind of abuse. Typically, it's neglect. Another big one is financial abuse, and then psychological abuse. But yeah, it's estimated that 1 in 10 elderly people have experienced at least one of those kinds of abuse, right? And this is actually more common for relatives than it is in facilities. Not that this abuse doesn't happen in nursing homes, but it's more common when family members are taking care. And the risks for that are when family members are taking care of an elderly relative, but they're also working full-time and they're stressed out. The risk increases for nursing home staff when they're overworked, when there's not enough staff, right? And so those are problems that we have to try to resolve so that we can mitigate some of the elder abuse that's happening. right? And by the way, as far as taking care of our elderly, the typical caregiver is a married, middle-aged woman who's working full-time, and she's usually taking care of her own aging parents or, her in-laws, right? That's kind of statistically the typical caregiver. And so we need to make sure that we set up some infrastructure so those people are supported when they're doing that care, in their own homes, and that we also do a better job with our nursing home facilities as well. Okay, finally, the last problem I want to talk about with respect to elderly people is poverty, right? So elderly people are at a greater risk of poverty, right, than people under the age of 65. And actually the risk of poverty, so let's say greater risk, the risk of poverty increases the older you get, right? So for 65 through 74-year-olds, the poverty rate is, I think, I have it? No, it's 8.6%. For 75 through 84, it's 9.3%. And then for 85 and up, it's 11.6%. Right, so again, not only is there an increased risk of poverty for older people, but as you get older, there's an even greater risk. That increased risk goes up. So, I mean, we're doing a little bit better now than we were, I don't know, in the beginning of the 20th century. It used to be before the Great Depression and the New Deal, and we set up Social Security. If you were old and you couldn't work, you were poor, right? So a huge proportion of our elderly were poor at the time. Then, of course, we set up Social Security, which is a safety net in old age, and we cut back on that poverty somewhat. But still, there's an increased risk of poverty, and anytime there's some kind of recession economically, the elderly people are likely to suffer poverty, or more likely to suffer poverty from that. The other thing about poverty with respect to the elderly is the risk is greater for older women than it is for older men. So risk is greater for elderly women rather than elderly men. Well, first of all, the risk of poverty is greater for women than men overall, right? Regardless of age. So I should say that. But there are some other reasons why the risk might be greater for elderly women than elderly men. First of all, women live longer, right? So the average life expectancy is, a few years more than for men, which means that they live longer to outlive savings and things like that. They live longer to experience poverty, live longer than men. But another reason for this might be the fact that women really only came into the workforce en masse in the 1960s and 70s, right? So, even then, they're working different kinds of jobs. So it's more likely for an elderly man, right, to have pensions and retirement benefits in old age than it is for an elderly woman, especially an elderly woman who was single and doesn't have, isn't getting her husband's pension or retirement benefits or what have you, right? So that might be some of the reasons why the risk of poverty is greater for older women. Okay, well, that's it. This was a nice short one for the lecture on aging and the elderly. I will see you in the next group chat.